I do think strongly that, and we saw this sort of play out in our conversations, I think waiting on AI will mean falling behind competition. I think you're going to miss the efficiency gains. I think it's a weaker candidate experience that gets delivered. How will we, if we're called up to the bench, how will we explain how the decisions were made and be able to validate that? But
there is a huge difference between the kind of processes that are being developed for the professional side versus those that are for the hourly, where automation has taken place very quickly in a whole range of industries, and they're seeing significant shifts in terms of the number of recruiters that are needed.
If I can eliminate all the transactional work, right, that is done, I talk about that magic wand throughout the entire process, that's a lot of time. And if I can keep the same number of recruiters and get rid of all that work below, you're not adding recruiters, but you're making them more consultative and future pipeline thinking.
Hi, I'm Johnny Campbell, CEO of Social Talent, and you're listening to the Hiring Excellence podcast. I'm delighted this week to be joined by three excellent guests, three people I've got to know over the last few years, two in particular who I probably know too well and don't want to know as much anymore, but that's a different story. And we're here to discuss the topic, as seems to be always the case every week, of AI in TA. But particularly, we're going to dig into the insights from a study that all of us participated in. I'll tell you about that in a few minutes, or one of our guests is going to dig deep and tell you about that in a few minutes, around how are real TA leaders in enterprises using tools or thinking about tools and what problems they're solving. So rather than this being just a typical, opinions of four people, we're actually going to dig into some data and some research we've done and share some stories around that. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests. So joining me from CareerXroads, we have the fabulous Hoyt and Gerry Crispin. Most of you, if you've ever worked in recruiting, ever listened to a podcast or read an article, probably know about Chris and Gerry. And I also hope you've had the pleasure of meeting our third fabulous guest, Cathy Henesey. Cathy is the VP of Extended Workforce, promoted from VP of Talent Acquisition within AdventHealth, who many of you in the US may be familiar with. And if you're not, Cathy's going to bring you up to speed on who AdventHealth is. And I've known Cathy over the last few years as being a prominent voice who's not afraid to speak out, tell it as it is, be a bit controversial, and we're hoping she brings that voice to bear here. So you're very welcome to the show, folks. I might start with you, Chris. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about the research that we all participated in over the last couple of months, what that looked like, what the aim was, and maybe we can begin to dig into some of the findings.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. We well, thanks for having us on, because I love the show. I think it's been maybe six years or so since Gerry and I have been on, and I think the last time we were on, we were in person. So it's nice to be back on the mic with you. We do a number of these. We do one every quarter. It was fun to do this one with you, where we really focused on AI within the hiring process, specifically within the interviewing step of those assessments and of that process. We pulled together about 35 TA leaders and practitioners in the space. We did this over 5 weeks. And we had a theme every week where we really focused in on how is AI being assessed, how is AI being used, implemented, and adopted or not adopted over the course of those 5 weeks. We came out with a series of key themes, outputs from that, which we'll talk about today, and also some action items. And we've kind of got a take on what we're seeing within large organizations. As a reminder, most of the participants that took part in this were at organizations that are hiring thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of folks a year. So this is certainly an enterprise slant on any of the data that we'll be sharing today.
Yeah. Cathy, could you share with our audience just some context about the type of hiring you do in healthcare, maybe some of the volumes at a high level, the skills that you hire for, and maybe give me an idea on what you see are the kind of obvious problems to be solved, that if you had a magic wand and you could find something that could fix a process, improve a process, make it faster, cheaper, etc. What are the big wins for you that you've either gone after or you'd like to go after? Maybe explain why.
Sure. Sure. Thanks. Cathy Henesey, as you said, I'm in a new role, the Vice President of Extended Workforce. I've been the Vice President of Talent Acquisition for AdventHealth for the last 7 years. And we have grown almost double in size in the last 7 years since I've joined the Orlando corporate team. We're now about over 105,000 employees. We average about 35,000 hires a year, 30,000 external, 9,000, or 8 to 9,000 internal movement. And as we've grown, it's become very, very apparent to us that we are hiring more contingent workforce and looking at a more global scope of putting people overseas to do just transactional work. And we certainly have been doing that in talent acquisition for the last couple of years. We can certainly talk about that. But that is really an interesting market. And so we had not had somebody that overlooked all of that. And we're going to Workday in December. And so Workday's cadence is to make that more formalized. And so we created this role for us to look at a global picture. My boss is the world optimization, global optimization leader, to look at all of our departments, even outside, obviously outside of HR, to where can we gain efficiencies and reduce costs. That's what the name of the game is in healthcare, is continuing to reduce costs. For the challenges that we face, and lots of things in all of that, managing labor, whether it's your internal or whatever type external resources you have, is simply the cost of it versus the tools that are available. When we talk about AI tools, there is amazing products out there that make a lot of great claims, but they're also very expensive. And so you have to measure, your return on investment for that product, which you're paying for per year, versus your cost of labor and doing these alternate resources. And so you have to kind of think about, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Because, so my problem in healthcare might not be your problem. I don't have the abundance of candidates like for registered nurses and clinical roles that are very difficult to fill, where, maybe another corporation has thousands of candidates as soon as they open a job posting. And so they need a tool to help weed through all of those candidates. And then the processing of them through the process. If I had a magic wand, if there was a tool, and there's ATS systems that get close, but just a magic wand that automates that entire process by clicking very few buttons behind the scenes, that would be incredible. Because if you really do time studies, which we do, on where are we spending time, it's getting candidates through that process and making sure that it's done accurately, because we have to conduct audits to make sure that that's done, because we're hiring people that take care of patients, right? So we've got to make sure that everything is checked. It's not there. That tool's not there yet. And, bits and pieces of it, every product that I see wants to take one portion of it. I need to solve the whole problem if I had a magic wand.
I love that analogy of the whole process. I was sharing this morning, I was getting a flight, and I was talking about applying for my passport. I had to get it renewed a couple of months ago. And I filled in my digital application online the Friday morning, uploaded my photograph, and it arrived in the post on Monday. I've never had that before in my life. And it's only because, we moved away in Ireland for a process where you sent a physical photograph with a physical form in an envelope full of all your paperwork to a department that had to take it out, unload it, approve it, type it into a system somewhere, get it done. It used to be a 4-week process. I got it in one working day. And I think, what we're seeing in recruiting is probably like that bureaucratic Department of Motor Vehicles type thing, where it's been very manual and we're just dying for it to move faster. Gerry, I know better than to ask you a specific narrow question. So respond to what Cathy's sharing or what Chris has shared, as you wish, sir.
I love that. I love that approach because I go that way anyway.
I know.
Cathy's talking. What hits me is she, that magic wand where, you have this one piece, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm thinking, on one dashboard, the typical system now, obviously there's time lost simply in moving from one dashboard to another. So issues like integration become critical. So it's not just AI, but just the overall thinking about what the future of work looks like when we hire, who's going to be doing the work, how many people do we need in what function. So, there's a whole host of conversations that were going on in this research that ranged literally in every little piece, AI being one of them. And AI certainly might be a solution to pieces of solving those things. But fundamentally, we're going to have to reimagine what that work looks like.
Yeah, I want to add and call out, Cathy mentioned the concept of price and making some tough budget decisions. I think we had two leaders where the conversation, they had to make really hard decisions. They'd been teeing up a couple of vendors for the last number of years to get them across the finish line internally. But when it came down, to the line to make the decisions, what they were being forced to decide on was, I got 5 headcount I got to give up in order to bring this technology in. And now you have an org health issue and you have an adoption issue, because we're seeing a lot of adoption. I'm sure we'll talk about that, Johnny, but we're seeing a lot of adoption challenges as well when that tech gets implemented. And it's not only a little bit heartbreaking, right? Because it's an evolution of those teams, but then there's a big risk there too, because these are not cheap products. These are not small checks that are getting written for them. And you're talking about a major disruption to how the orgs in some cases are structured and how they'll even work. And I just think that's a consideration sometimes that, at least from the outside, gets often missed.
I think, we've seen a lot between the four of us examples where you've seen, call it really successful AI adoption has happened, and you've made huge savings, to your point, Cathy, and improved quality metrics, speed metrics, etc. Mainly, I'd argue, in the hourly hiring space, right? Examples like UPS in terms of drivers and warehouse staff, 7-Eleven in terms of retail stores, McDonald's in restaurants, H&M in retail stores, all great use cases where they're all telling us how they've taken away hundreds of recruiters. So you're talking about like real P&L savings, not this notional, we saved hours nonsense, right? But this kind of like, these headcount don't exist next year by these salaries, which is this millions of savings, right? And then the quality goes up, let's say measured by attrition or NPS or literally whatever metric you want to pick. And it's faster for candidates and all this kind of stuff. It's not quite the same though in enterprise professional hiring or non-hourly roles where you do want someone skilled or even semi-skilled. For certain, I've seen that they're not getting these 7-minute complete hiring process run by AI and everyone's happy. That doesn't exist for accountants. It doesn't exist for nurses. It doesn't exist for salespeople. Not yet. Maybe it never will. Like Chris, in the research, maybe 2 topics, if you don't mind digging into for us to discuss. What are people using it for? If not everything, what are the things? Because I feel they are using it for something, right? So these companies are getting valued at a fortune and making revenue, right? And what are the obstacles to it not going faster? Maybe just those 2 things you wouldn't mind digging into the research on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, Jay. The breadth of difference between adoption and permission in the orgs is kind of staggering, because in some instances we're seeing full in, like they're encouraging talent acquisition team members to create agentic solutions. They're building their own internally. Is a culture of like let's go. But then we got the other side of the spectrum where some organizations aren't even allowed to use Chat GPT to build a job description, right? That, like, even the most basic of stuff. I do think that we are seeing AI assistance kind of gain traction in the interview process. I think the leaders certainly, and from the discussions that we had on the panels, I think the leaders see value in note-taking and structured prompts that come out of that, right? Transcription services, a lot of us use that all the time on Zoom, right? So we're seeing a lot of that find its way into the interview pieces. And even in a couple of cases, I think mentioned, there were like coaching, right? To really improve consistency. And certainly some of the documentation in that process. But I think what we notice across the board is a lot of that usage or that adoption really sort of like even a high value or high promising like AI tool, like those are often getting rejected if they aren't integrating seamlessly into those platforms and into those workflows. So adoption really hinges on that workflow integration. It is what we're seeing even at the starting level, sort of the baby steps of sort of turning that on and making that available is still a rejection factor. If that change management component is really not thought through and delivered very cleanly.
I think it's interesting. Like we that category, let's say that interview intelligence category, we just launched a new product in that space. So we spent the last year digging into some of the pains around that, because I do think it's an exciting space. But it does start with is it worth spending money on? Like, what is the problem you're solving, right? Because I've been guilty of, I'd love to build a tool that does X, but it has to be actually doing it at a value. And listen, these tools cost money to deliver, right? As a provider of tools, the AI cost to deliver parts of these processes are bloody expensive, right? This isn't like traditional software. You write the code and you eke out 90% gross margins. You're handing over money to Google or to OpenAI or to somebody, like a lot of money for the utilization of their technology for parts of this stuff. And some of them is much more expensive than others, right? So you got to charge an amount. To Cathy's point, though, there's a max you can pay, and whatever that is, it's coming down every year, it's growing, right? Because the business wants us to get more productive. So it does come back to what is the problem you're solving. I'll give an example of some of the ones that I've heard, and I heard from the survey. Some of it's compliance risk, right? The risk of audit, and if you're OFCCP regulated in the US, or in lots of parts of Europe, you've got spot checks on there. You taking notes, because that's the way to prove that you have an unbiased hiring decision, etc. And the lack of that usually is found against the company. So you can measure it as we could end up with these fines. You can measure it around what time are we spending. I know Marcus and ThoughtWorks, who I think most of you know. His business is hiring people who get billed out. And to hire them, he has to ask those billable consultants to sit in interviews. And they spend a lot of time prepping and a lot of time writing up notes. And like, getting rid of that gives more billable hours back to the business, and you can do a cost analysis of that. So you can justify these things. You can basically reduce maybe the amount of interviews that have to be conducted, which maybe reduce the amount of recruiters and hiring managers on those things that can be there. But what doesn't fly is it'll be cool, or it saves me a bunch of time, but I'm not going to translate that time into headcount reductions. So, these things are really important. Like I heard a great quote from a TA leader saying, in her organization, they use the jobs to be done process to evaluate things. And they started on their AI journey, and they said they had to throw it away. He said, because this wasn't the jobs to be done. This was the problems to be solved. Jobs to be done, it kind of assumed that we should just get better. Problems to be solved was saying, is it even a problem? I guess it'd be nice to automate it, but like, should we? And even is the cost right? So, Cathy, you brought up a really excellent point in the research to say, and I'm going to paraphrase, and you can correct me on this. You'll look at a tool and go, "That's brilliant," but could I just hire people to do that? Because a lot of the times the people can do it cheaper, and maybe there's less risk from an AI bias perspective. It's easier to procure, so to speak, because it's not going through all your AI committees, etc. So give me an insight in terms of that comment, because that was super interesting, and you made a point that maybe a lot of people don't realize, is that there may be alternatives that we should be looking at.
I think I went down the path. I got introduced to a firm that does the outsource recruiting. Basically contract recruiters offshore. So you manage them yourself. It's not a big RPO project or contract or anything that has to be signed. And so and I've been approached by other firms that do this as well. So I started looking at this. When I looked at the first tool that we adopted, Hired Score, and looked at the cost. The problem we were trying to solve there is we were going to Workday. We were 3 years out. So that means we were with Taleo for another 3 years, which is being sunsetted. So they're offering no support, very archaic machine. And I had 2 million candidates in there. And what this tool offered was to mine those candidates on new jobs coming in. Well, that's brilliant, right? That's what I need. I can't pay somebody enough to go through thousands and thousands of resumes on an hourly basis to do that. And so when I looked at that tool, it definitely made sense, because it just machine automated did it so much faster. And using AI based on our past hiring, I can easily make a business case for that and solve it. And particularly, it was getting at candidates that we already paid for because they were in our database. And I still was at the height of high numbers of recs to fill. And as it turned out, I think we're over in the last 18 months, we've hired well over 2,000 people from this. And 67% of them have been registered nurses. So people fear, oh, it's just going to get the low hanging fruit people you already have. No, it went after nurses, which, a position unfilled is costly. And some people are like, well, you don't, that's not fun to measure. Executives don't understand that. Is they understand overtime and they understand contract labor when positions aren't filled, because you have to fill a nurse. You can't just pick up extra work, right? You can't have a worker pick up extra things. You have to have so many nurses per patient. And so an unfilled position costs us money because we do have to backfill it with an overtime or a contractor. And so it was easy for me to make that, jump, if you will, on what the return on investment. The interviewing tools, it's hard. You speed up the process maybe by a day. How do you measure that? Where gain that efficiency? Less time canvas process, that's a little harder to justify, but amazing tools out there. I'm sure if that answered your question.
No, it does. I had a great example. Matt Howe from BT was on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he was sharing an example of how they brought in AI automation to reduce attrition. Why reducing attrition, and how does that translate into cost? Well, they'd done the maths on every new hire. It's a call center hiring. He said every new hire had to be given a training course. They had to pay per person for. They had to be given a laptop, and they were on training for their first X weeks when they literally couldn't sit on calls. So there's zero value. So you're paying somebody who is not delivering any service to your business for a certain period of time until they get trained. And they asked finance to calculate how much that costs. They said, well, just that bit is £4,000. But just that bit. There's probably knock-on effects of other things, but like the hard costs were 4,000. So if they could reduce attrition, it's less people they hire by 4,000. So it was a simple use case. So he took a punt and said, I'm going to reduce my ad spend to pay for a pilot, because if it works, I won't need to advertise as much because I won't need as many people. So I'll take a chance on this. And it worked out. And he paid for it with existing funds. We were able to prove the use case. And there was a multiple of return, hard savings. And your point around reducing overtime, it's a hard saving the business can understand. I think tools that make reduce hours for recruiters, they're not a hard saving unless there's a real headcount or down or revenue in. And Gerry, if I come to you on this, like sometimes the elephant in the room seems to be in these conversations is, these tools will get rid of recruiters. And maybe that's the ROI. Or, some will generate revenue, some will reduce overtime. And that's kind of a lovely story because everyone wins then. But a lot of these tools are just going to reduce the need for recruiters, or my mental, Gerry.
In the long run, they absolutely will reduce the number of recruiters. But one of the things that's coming out of this conversation is kind of a lack of standards for which we could develop that ROI. If you don't have a standard approach to how you collect notes, for example, how you summarize those notes, how you use the notes, how you defend when somebody it says that it was unfair, et cetera, those kinds of things are not necessarily done well and are not reliably repeated in a company. And so when you try to figure out how many hours would be saved, it depends. It depends on the types of jobs. It depends on the training of the recruiter. It depends on who's holding the hiring manager accountable, those kinds of things. But in the future, you're going to have some of those standards very clear if AI is going to be used, and you want to defend that it's being done fairly and at least as well, if not much better, than the way we've done it. Because there's a higher level of consistency in how we would do it once we've developed it. And I do think there's a lot of Chris mentioned there's a lot of interview related applications coming in, and companies are beginning to use them. Some of them are better than others, but obviously they're getting better all the time.
I think so. Just to add to what Gerry said, I thought it was a really interesting part of the conversation when somebody made the counterpoint we're worried about fairness and biases, but then we kind of went off on this tangent about how that's still not locked down with humans. We still have a major challenge of consistency in note taking and structured questions and the execution of how those are interviewed and how selection gets done and all of that. And so I think a couple of folks threw their hands up and said, well, why wouldn't I trust the AI to do it? Because right now we're trusting people to do it, and we know that they're kind of screwing that up along the way, right? Because we talk about legal and compliance risks, right, at the top, sort of that top barrier level for adoption. And I think, to Gerry's point, like, AI tools that touch any level, I think, of candidate evaluation, even if it's sort of indirectly, I think that those just continue to get a lot of scrutiny, local and federal laws, but really requiring a more close partnership with legal teams. And we say we've been partnered with them before, and everybody kind of, TA leaders, we kind of roll our eyes. We don't want to, I don't want to deal with legal, that sort of thing. But I think this is sort of forcing our hand to get a little more snugly with the legal groups in terms of trying to figure out what tech can we bring in, and how really does that impact the organization downstream.
You remind me, Chris, of a phrase or two words that I loved that came out of the research. Was this phrase black box? And it was one of the leaders had spoken about the fact that they have a really rigorous program of learning and enablement in their organization, where they certify all the hiring managers and interviewers. They teach them their methodology. They have a rigid methodology of assessment, how to use behavioral interviews, how to sell the company, a rigid framework around competencies, all these wonderful things that we all aspire to have. But then they let the hiring managers loose, and they have no idea what happens in the real world.
No accountability, no oversight.
It's a black box. And so I think it connects to the legal piece, though, right? Chris and Gerry, to come in on it, right? And Cathy, I'd love to get your view, because I'm sure you've had to try and make this pitch. I hear such conflicting views. I'm using air quotes for those of you who are listening and not watching, because everything from, we'll never want all the notes recorded because they're admissible in a court case, and that we know there are bad actors in our organization, and someone's going to mess up. And if there's an AI record of it, then that's going to be brought up in the court case and we're screwed. That's one view. The other extreme I've heard, really interesting argument, was that a fellow TA professional shared that, their view on and their legal advice on particularly California law, which I think is a bit more progressive in the amount of cases it's seen around AI and hiring, was that if you can actively show that you have a process to open the black box, see what's happening, and you have a process of how to address these issues, if someone does bring your hiring manager to court, the court's going to more likely find your favor, because you're actually able to demonstrate that we're listening, we're watching, and we're trying to remove this. They're conflicting opinions. There doesn't seem to be a consensus. One lawyer will tell you can't because, the other will say you need to because. And I don't know. That it hasn't played out yet. There isn't a standard view of this. Maybe there's not enough case law yet to actually say it's definitely going to come down this side or that side. But I'd love to get your thoughts on these obstacles, because they're very real.
You're hitting the bullseye of the target. For sure. Go ahead, Cathy.
Oh, I'm just going to say, like, I'm just bringing these type of thoughts to our legal team, because they don't think about, it's just, I saw I think it was a chat in our forum about some of the laws about retention and coming up in some of these states and recording it. And I was like, oh my gosh, we do not have a policy of that. So I brought it to our legal team and I said, this is something we need to think about, because just naturally you're using Teams, you're saving, you're transcribing, recording it, and they just save it in their files and they're keeping it forever. Right. And then if we get sued, then someone's going to ask for it, and nobody's talked about, well, maybe they should be deleting it or summarizing it. And so it's not a risk, but I love the, analogy of all these things that we're doing from an audit standpoint for AI, but yet we don't do it for our own human bias. Where's that if I were a lawyer, I would totally bring that up. And the opposite side is, where's the data on your human bias?
I think this is the first time. Yeah, I think this is the first time in 30 years I have seen TA leaders proudly announce that they'll just be a fast follower.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Like they're happy to kind of see sort of how this plays out. They don't have to be first.
Nobody wants to be a case precedent.
No, and I
No.
think, but I really think, I do think strongly that, and we saw this sort of play out in our conversations. I think waiting on AI will mean falling behind competition. I think you're going to miss the efficiency gains. I think that it's a weaker candidate experience that gets delivered. But all those things have to be balanced, right, with the partnerships that we talked about from a compliance and a legal standpoint, and being able to audit that. And Johnny, to your point, that black box of like, how will we, if we're called up to the bench, how will we explain how the decisions were made and be able to validate that? But it is just it's just kind of a funny time to sort of watch folks back up and go, I don't need to be first anymore.
In the past, about half the companies are risk averse to the point where, yes, notes are not something you're going to keep for very long, and there's a whole bunch of other things that go into the ability to look like you're complying, but not have anything that's going to make you look bad. The problem with that is you really don't have a reliable and trustworthy process, and the candidates know it. They know that they're being moved around. They're being just it's a problem long term, forever.
Well,
I
I
think
mean,
the future
Yeah.
is going to change that because you're going to get some efficiencies as we develop our skills in looking at these things, and they become better and they continue to evolve. And at that point, you're going to see the difference between those who are risk averse and those that are willing to build a consistent, reliable process and be transparent about it.
yeah, Johnny, it goes back to your question about, are we going to reduce recruiters? Like, I think we're so far from that. Like, yes, as Jerry said, eventually, but like, if when somebody asks me about it, it's like, I still have 8,000 openings. I mean, I'm not reducing recruiters until I get that down to some manageable number and less than 30 days time to fill, which I know people don't love that metric, but that's something executives understand. And we're running 90 days to fill on nursing. I got a long way to go before I'm reducing RN recruiters to AI, right? I need to get that down to 30 days minimum. And I need to do that through automation, right? Processing through candidates, keeping them in a pipeline for the next step, right? To the point that there's so much we're not doing. Oh my gosh. I mean, pipelining and sourcing, it's not easy with humans. And we've got to figure out a way to how to queue people up quickly.
And so the differences between the professional level, which I think you started off with, Johnny, when we started this, there is a huge difference between the kind of processes that are being developed for the professional side versus those that are for the hourly, where automation has taken place very quickly in a whole range of industries, and they're seeing significant shifts in terms of the number of recruiters that are needed.
I kind of feel like Cathy's talking about it's not on or off, right? And certainly at the volumes, Cathy, that you're hiring at, I wonder if you feel that I don't want to speak for you, but like if you're an organization that's sort of treating AI as an augmentation, right, as a layer, not a replacement for recruiting, not a replacement for the judgment that comes from those hiring teams, or I think those are the ones who maybe get the most long-term value. Right? Like just flipping it on and getting rid of this staff, but really just
Sure.
bringing in this layer of assistance on the front, which
Yeah.
might be what, yeah.
If I can eliminate all the transactional work, right, that is done, and talk about that magic wand throughout the entire process, that's a lot of time. And if I can keep the same number of recruiters, but give them more true, at the top in nursing, we call it the top of the license, right? The top of their expertise, and get rid of all that work below, you're not adding recruiters, but you're making them more consultative and future pipeline thinking.
Well, I think what, we come back to the ROI point, and we're nearly at wrap up time, folks. We could do this for another 40 minutes, but you mentioned, Cathy, about just kind of keeping your laser focus on the value you drive to the business, right? Which again, you're someone who spoke about cost at the start, but you're not thinking about just cost in your net TA cost, your cost per hire. You're thinking about the cost of overtime the business has to spend. So therefore, how can TA reduce that cost of overtime? And that to me is the key mindset. Like you could end up with a TA team in 6 years that has the same amount of recruiters, but the business value you're deriving is 3x. You've reduced attrition, you've driven sales numbers, you've reduced overtime. We had a guest on the podcast recently talked about how they're banking in the US, and they said their big focus is cost. So they're looking at how can they improve the negotiation skills of recruiters and hiring managers so the median salary offer comes down, because that multiplied across the business is much more valuable than reducing 4 recruiters in terms of headcounts. You reduce, get $2,000 down per salary offered over 30,000 roles. That makes a huge difference, right? So it's thinking not just about cost for my budget, but cost for the business, strategy for the business, how you're driving revenue. I think it is a much more holistic approach. So I want to bring it to a close, and maybe I'll start with you, Cathy, in terms of if you were to pick one piece of advice. It's hard for leaders sitting here facing this challenge of how do I plan for 26 and onwards, and how do I think about AI tools, people, automation? What would be one thing you'd advise them to think about or focus on?
I think you hit it on the nose about just the business, the how are you impacting the business? If you're a TA leader today and you're going to go to executives asking them to spend $1 million on a brand new tool, and you probably need 3 of them, so then you're looking at $3 million. You cannot go with any TA metric. It just is impossible. You have got to hit business and metrics. I'm going to reduce overtime. I'm going to reduce my $150 million in staffing agency costs, right? I'm going to reduce turnover because we're going to hire better quality people. And here's how it's going to work. Like you have to use the real metrics that hit their bottom line, not your TA bottom line. It's pennies if you think about it compared to your revenue. And you really need to understand that. And it has to be measurable. Like they're going to hold you accountable for it. Or at least my team does. The next year when I want to renew that $1 million, like show me, otherwise, no, it's a no.
I haven't heard that put that well before, Cathy. So thank you. You summed it up beautifully. Chris, I'm going to go to you to leave the last word to Gerry, because he'll take it anyway.
Yeah. A couple of things. I think you've got to embed AI tools directly into existing workflows and into the ATS platforms in order to get that adoption. I think that's what Cathy was kind of saying earlier, is trying to pull these things together. I think leaders are going to have to set the expectations up front for metrics, right? What does success look like? And I think this should include adoption. I think it should include compliance, and of course any efficiencies. And I think ideally you're establishing oversight frameworks, right, to sort of audit that and the usage regularly. So making sure that tools are fair and compliant, to Gerry's point earlier, like effective over time. But I really do think that AI powered hiring assistance is going to be a standard feature, certainly at the enterprise level. But I don't think adoption is going to be like evenly distributed. And I don't think it's going to come without its own challenges, its own frictions, right? So while the tools are going to continue to evolve really, really quickly, I think the big challenge for leaders like Cathy, I think it's going to lie in this term we continue to come up with, was operational readiness, right? So I think outdated processes, these tech stacks, I think somebody used the phrase in our research, Johnny, the Franken-stacks, right? These fragmented stacks of technology we have sitting out there, and sometimes that take years to unwind. And I think that inconsistent training, all of that is going to limit the value of some of even the best purchases. And I think those are just a couple of watch outs as we kind of continue on down this road.
Super advice. Gerry, last word to you.
Well, there's really 2 things that I think we need to spend a little bit more time on. I think the first and most important is really rethinking or reimagining where we are. Most folks have not really mapped lately their process for the various classes of worker that they hire. Whether it be executives, hourly, professional, et cetera, or some kind of specialized that requires a whole different kind of certification. So I think that making sure you have basic processes for what we are doing, and then doing a little bit of reimagining, a little visioning of what could be automated, what would we love to see automated, even if it's downstream a year, 2 years, 3 years. Would you like to have AI be able to interview, if you will, the top of the funnel and do it in a way that's fair, that's consistent, that was transparent, and that was engaging? Well, we don't have tools that, in my opinion, that can do that today, but tomorrow there might be. So I think we need to deal with that. The unintended consequences, I think, should also be made a list of. What we were hearing, both in the research as well as anecdotally, we're seeing a lot of folks concerned about how candidates are evolving their use of AI. And we need to have some transparency about here's what we see you doing, and here's what we're comfortable with, here's what we're not. And by the way, here's what we're using it for. In the past, we never really told candidates every detail of our process, but I think we're going to have to be more transparent about how we're using AI as well, in order to get some face validity from them, that we're trustworthy in terms of this interchange that we have, where we make a decision that they can do the job, they make a decision that they want to come here, and they have good reasons for it because we've been transparent. So that's what has
Gerry,
to change.
Thank you for bringing the candidate back into it. We never even touched on the fact that the candidates have all this AI power joining interviews, and they're recording stuff, and they've got this stuff going on, and we got to think about their experience. It's been a pleasure. I love chatting about this conversation, especially with the three of you. You raised the game, and I hope the audience appreciates that. Cathy, Chris, Gerry, thank you so much for joining us here today to discuss this. And a big thank you to the audience as well for listening and tuning in, watching this live or listening to this on your favorite podcast. We'll be back again next week with another episode of Hiring Excellence. Until then, take care.